Two poem days are atypical, considering the fact that I usually have things scheduled. However, I was supposed to do a little quaint, cozy poem about the Avatar, The Last Airbender, and Sozin's Comet and everything, and weave it so that it could allow hurt hearts to rest in one place. But instead, life happened, and I had a conversation with somebody, which sparked this poem. It's simply called Minneapolis, and based on the title, I assume you know what this is about. Um, there's a lot going on in this poem, and it's a lot. A lot of these thoughts are dilemmas of mine that I haven't really been able to formulate properly, and I'm just putting this out there. Okay. If even the shield is only paint, then nobody is safe, and my mind immediately flips to a double edged sword. But some of us have always known that, and some of us are only learning now what it feels like to be visible to power in the wrong way. I mourn for all that I've had to. Let me explain. I am ashamed of how little I feel, and I'm honest enough to say it. I watch bodies move across screens, and my chest does not always tighten anymore. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. Sometimes I notice the absence before the grief itself, and that absence scares me more than anger ever did. There are people's lives being taken by ICE, souls disappeared without paperwork, handcuffed into hearses that look like logistics. And I search my body for the reaction I am supposed to have. It does not always arrive. What arrives instead is a weird arithmetic, a balance sheet of pain. Balance sheets of pain, plural. A ledger that I never asked to inherit, but learned to keep anyway. I think this is how they must feel when they see us die. And then I hate myself for thinking that, because it sounds like justification, because it sounds familiar, because it sounds familiar. And it sounds like betrayal, and still it is true in the same way that ugly truths arrive without permission. I know we share a humanity. I know this intellectually. I know it academically. I know this through lived experience. I know it in the way people say they know gravity exists even while standing still. But my heart has learned patterns the way a muscle learns tension. Minority life has been rendered rehearsable. Another clip, another mom crying, another name, another march that looks like the last march with different signs and the same ache behind the eyes. Different day, same thing, new name. We have been trained to recognize the arc of the story before the story begins. We know when the footage will loop. We know when the commentators will arrive. We know which photos will be selected, the mugshot instead of the graduation photo or the photo with their family, the snapshot that makes a life look like a warning instead of a person. We know how death is laundered into logic. We know how innocence is made conditional. We know how a body is weighed, not by what it was, but by how inconvenient it is to mourn. So, yes, there is a numbness that comes from repetition, but it is not indifference. And then Minneapolis. Two white bodies, two souls, two deaths that refuse to fit the old script cleanly. And I cry. I cry not only for them, but for what the reaction exposes. Because suddenly the language falters. Suddenly the talking heads cannot decide whether these lives are worth the same gymnastics of excuse. And in that hesitation, something obscene became so visible. The people in power look at bodies that resemble their own and still cannot see themselves. They discredit the dead as if proximity alone should have guaranteed protection, as if whiteness itself is supposed to be armor, and when it fails, the system does not apologize, it shrugs. This is where my confusion multiplies. If race is more than a construct, why does it kill so efficiently? If whiteness is power, why does it not save its own when obedience fails to perform correctly? If the nation claims to protect life, why does it require such careful sorting before deciding which deaths count as tragedy and which count as procedure? I look at the reactions side by side, and I do not see equivalence. I see patterns learning how to adapt. The same machinery, different calibration. For black and brown bodies, and the oppressed, Death is explained away in advance. For these white bodies, death is minimized after the fact, not because they are disposable, but because acknowledging their vulnerability would crack the myth that keeps everything else standing. A nation that cannot protect anybody is a nation that survives by narration alone. And narration requires hierarchy, it requires contrast, it requires someone to be exceptional and someone to be expected. This is where my apathy terrifies me, because I do not want to become what history has done to us. I do not want my empathy to calcify into symmetry. I do not want whataboutism to become a shelter I hide inside because it feels fairer than grief. And yet my body remembers too much. It remembers ancestors paved over for roads. It remembers laws written in neutral language that learned how to bruise selectively. It remembers watching justice stall while cameras rolled and promises aged badly. So when I feel nothing, I'd like to think it's not because I believed these lives do not matter. I'd like to think it's because I have been taught that outrage is a resource and I have watched it be wasted. There are too many truths alive at once, and they do not line up politely. Shared humanity exists, structural violence exists, selective mourning exists, media choreography exists, personal exhaustion exists, moral clarity exists, and fractures under pressure. None of these cancel the others out. I am allowed to be confused without being immoral, I tell myself. I am allowed to name the resentment without letting it harden into cruelty, I tell myself. I am allowed to ask what it means when even proximity to power cannot guarantee safety, and what that says about the fantasy that anyone was ever safe to begin with. History does not offer refunds for emotional labor spent too early. I'm speaking forward, not upward, not downward. I don't know where I'm speaking, just into the mess. And my heart splinters watching the streets fill with bodies that did not gather like this for hours. Again, the equivalence. I recognize the choreography, the candles, the chants, the signs, the sudden vocabulary of grief that was once called excessive, disruptive, inappropriate when it carried our names. I watched people who would not hold a minority body upright now cradle their own dead with tenderness. And the irony tastes metallic. They say our people, as if the word has only just learned weight, as if belonging is something discovered only when it bleeds back at you. I see fear on white faces. White said ironically, deliberately, because I am watching something new arrive in their eyes that I have not seen before. Not sympathy, not solidarity, not allyship. Fear. Fear of a system they were taught to trust as infrastructure, not threat. Fear of a violence they believed traveled outward, never inward. Fear of a machinery they never had to have explained to them by a parent or a guardian sitting too close on a couch, choosing words carefully, preparing a child for a world that already decided something before that child ever breathed. We had those conversations early about posture, about tone, about pronunciation, about survival, about how the world sees you before you speak your name, and even sometimes after you speak your name. They did not always, and now they are learning in public. And what terrifies me is not their fear itself, but the moment it arrived. And it scares me because I always believed that whiteness was the shield, that proximity to power was supposed to be insulation, that looking like the system was meant to keep you safe, and now even that is cracking. Cracking insinuates that it was held together before, but in this case, it was never. Then what does that say about what the system has always been willing to do? If this is how they treat their own, when the myth begins to fail, what will they do to the people who have been building this nation with their bodies while never being allowed to claim it? I do not want to spread fear. This whole ordeal leaves me standing in a weird state that cannot protect anyone, watching grief finally become democratic and realizing that equality, when it arrives this way, is not justice. If a nation cannot protect anybody, then the question is not whose lives matter more. The question, the dilemma is who benefits from pretending that some lives ever did, and what it costs the rest of us to keep watching our belittlement without being allowed to look away. Thank you.